Field Epidemiology. It's the last lecture for epidemiology. This is always the last lecture that we have, and there's so much that I wish we had the chance to cover. And if you choose to do a career in epidemiology or public health, you can have more courses in this type of content. So when I was a doctoral student, I had courses in infectious disease epidemiology, survey design and survey methodology, cancer epidemiology, epidemiology of zoonotic diseases, epidemiology of foodborne diseases. So there's so many more things that you can cover in this discipline, but I think the topics we're going to cover today may be of great interest to you. So before or during or after watching this video, I often encourage folks to see some of these outbreak videos, but one of the ones that I focus on is the outbreak that was in Western Africa, and it was a Vice video focusing on Liberia and the Ebola epidemic. And in that video, you'll hear a catchy song that was associated with kind of people who were minimizing the impact of the Ebola virus. It was actually, the song's called Ebola in Town. You can Google it. And if you wanted to, you could probably even hear people singing Corona in Town. So if you haven't already watched that video, please watch it, and you'll learn how many of the things that played out during the Ebola epidemic are happening right here in the United States and around the world. And why? A lot of it comes down to lack of trust and communication. So what is field epidemiology? Well, field epidemiology is when we apply epidemiology to an unexpected problem that often needs a timely response and a timely intervention. And the investigation needs to occur fast. So rather than us doing just epidemiology at the computer or through some cross-sectional study or a cohort study, we need to be rapid investigators. And it may require the implementation of a variety of the study designs that you've already learned about, including the case control studies. But we don't have the time always to evaluate the effectiveness of our interventions, so sometimes we have to use historical knowledge about interventions to inform our response. And then we have to study even our interventions, all in a rapid fashion. If the event is critical in nature, impacting a lot of things, it may actually cause the incident command system to be elevated or activated at your place of work or employment, or if you're part of one of these teams. I was going to put up the figure, but it's not for public use, but our COVID-19 team on the campus, we're also involved as our group has a liaison to another group that has a liaison to another group. The person at the state who's currently in the role that Professor Graybill used to be in is one of the leads. But there's this whole incident command system structure. So if you're interested in applying for one of the current contact tracer positions with the state government, you could go online now to FEMA and do the ICS 100 training if you haven't already had it. And you can also, I think, do ICS 700. And that would make your application stronger because the state right now has fully activated the Emergency Operations Center and they're using an incident command system. Your other classes cover this topic a little bit more. So the implementation of outbreak epidemiology often involves the use of field epidemiology techniques. This whole CDC Field Epidemiology Manual is totally available online. You can click on any of the links. These are actually links here, not in this video, but if you were to Google search CDC Field Epidemiology Manual, you can buy the print version for like $50, but your tax dollars and people's tax dollars paid for it, so why not just go ahead and go online and use it? You can see that there's 25 chapters associated with it. Now, a lot of these chapters we've already covered to some extent, but one of the chapters we haven't talked a lot about that is extremely critical is how people perceive risk and how people hear messages. How do we communicate? So, what factors influence risk perception? And it's important to know that risk perception, a person's perception, is their reality. They assume it is true. If they perceive it, they assume it's true. So just because it's not true, or if it is true, how they perceive it is probably more important than whether or not it's actually the truth in their world. So their perception is their truth. So the generally more acceptable risk are things that people deal with voluntarily, like they accept the risk of lung cancer from smoking. It's under their control. They can do something about it. Different things have, if by doing it, there might be some sort of benefit. If it's something, it just happens naturally, there's not much you can do about it, that's usually received better. If the people giving them information are trusted, that makes the risk more acceptable. If it's something that they're used to, like, well, we're kind of accustomed to the fact that cigarettes cause lung cancer, so, we're used to it, or we're kind of used to things like the common cold. If it affects primarily adults, people are more accepted of it. Now, if it affects kids, no way. People get a little more anxious about that. If it's foreign or new or exotic, that gets people anxious. If information about it is coming from things that people view as untrusted, so if there's skepticism in the government, they're not going to be as likely to accept messages from there. If they think that it's been human-made, and that's going to make people less acceptable of that risk. If it's going to be something where there might be a benefit or not, if dealing with it involves people being controlled by others, that's not going to go over well. And if the actions associated with it are also imposed and people don't have a lot of choice, that's not going to go over well. So you can see coronavirus fits a lot over on these categories, and these are harder categories to deal with. And this isn't new. Like, this has been in that CDC Field Epidemiology Manual and things before it. They cited several references, so this isn't new. Now, when we're communicating with people, the most important thing that you can do, if you're a contact tracer and you have to interact with a person, or if you're the public information officer, it's important to first communicate empathy. Even if you seem like you're being over empathetic, even if it's not natural for you, you better work on it, because empathy is a much more effective communication strategy than anything else. If people don't feel like you care about them and their welfare, then anything else you say after that is irrelevant to them. Honesty and openness. They have to feel like you're being honest. Are you going to be committed to following up? Are you dedicated? Do you have a track record of working in this area? So sometimes trying to develop these three in the middle of a pandemic or a crisis, it's a little too late for that. So these are things that you have to have, in many cases, going into it. And then you also have to be viewed as a person or an entity or an agency that's both competent and has expertise. If you are viewed incompetent, if you do not seem like you've got a long history of being dedicated and communicating with people, your commitment, if you're viewed as dishonest or not empathetic and not caring, those things are going to make you a problem. If you have to speak with the public on controversial things, or if they're asking you a lot of questions, in many cases it's not appropriate during an outbreak to be the spokesperson. The spokesperson should be the public information officer. So if you're involved in the health department or a state agency involved in a pandemic response or any way involved with it, it's better to keep your mouth shut and not be a speaker on the matter if it's related to your job. Because there's a person at your entity that does that, who speaks with one voice so that we are able to ensure trust and credibility. So what should that public information officer be speaking about? They need to have the empathy. They need to tell people what they can do, who's affected, what, when, where, how, and all that stuff. They need to tell people what's known, and they also need to communicate uncertainty. They need to provide explanations on why the public health actions are being taken. They need to demonstrate their commitment and say it. They need to indicate that additional information will continue to be provided, and they need to provide people an outlet for finding more information as it's developed. So what makes something an epidemic or an outbreak? And there's something I want to go back on this on. There's more information on this, by the way. They also tell health agencies, don't overcommit. Don't tell people you can do things unless you are absolutely certain you're going to be able to do it. So don't overcommit. So what goes into defining an epidemic or outbreak? So outbreaks are epidemics confined to a localized area. So that's a fairly generic term. And then, of course, we know a pandemic is an epidemic that spans multiple continents. And so we've kind of got a good idea on that. When we do epidemiological field investigations, the order in which the investigation is done is very similar to where if you were even doing any type of risk assessment and with any environmental problem. We have to do our initial response. Like first we have to verify, like, is this actually happening? Is this real? That's kind of the hazard identification. Then we have to have a mechanism for obtaining information about the cases. We need our case definitions and we need the data collection. And this involves also having the tools and the infrastructure to do this. We need the ability to assess who's being exposed. What are the potential exposures? And then we need to continue to do data analysis that's able to link the exposures to the cases. So we can learn how the cases and the exposure are related, which then informs our interventions and our ability to also determine who's at greatest risk. And beyond case and data collection, mortality data collection is also in there. Once we've characterized the risk and developed some intervention strategies or hypotheses, we then have to go ahead and take that gamble, hopefully on good data, on which interventions are going to work best. We need to continually evaluate our interventions. We're trying to manage our risk. We're trying to manage the probability of adverse outcomes. So very similar to a risk assessment. So the world of outbreak epidemiology or field epidemiology is rapidly changing. Like we have greater access to GIS for making maps. Technology is allowing us to do tree construction and reconstruction of transmission. Like mobile phone technology is able to tell us who a person's been near. Even if they didn't even talk to that person, the phone knows who they've been near. Molecular epidemiology, we can like sequence whole genomes so quickly and we can monitor changes and strains over time. Like this isn't just with the coronavirus. I mean, they do molecular epidemiology and pulse field gel electrophoresis on strains of like E. coli 0157 and spinach to trace it back to which farm in the United States and which cow or population of cattle did the E. coli 0157 come from. And that goes into like the phylogenetics. They can actually look at the strains of things. So there's all kinds of great information. Google Trends. You can like actually search a word and see what parts of the United States or what countries are searching things like fever and headache. This just came out a few hours ago. Apple and Google are able to help support contact tracing by telling health agencies, or potentially telling everyone, like through an alert message saying, hey, a person you were near yesterday has the coronavirus. You know, that is something that is a real possibility that these things can be rolled out. Additionally, apps allow us to replace questionnaires with the ability to put the paper questionnaire into an online format that can then gather data from people more quickly, and it's incredible how interconnected these things can be. In the future, you can imagine having smartwatches that gather information on the temperature of a person or heart rates or other things that may be indicative of, or breathing rates that may be indicative of a person having a particular disease. And then that information in real time is transmitted to some sort of system that can be activated or turned on during an epidemic or during a pandemic. It's incredible how quickly this world's going to change. Already, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has been doing influenza surveillance for years where we can track the influenza. They're doing this for COVID-19 using their influenza syndromic surveillance systems. And they can actually put the two and overlay these systems together, and you can see, how maybe the flu and the COVID-19 things are getting mixed up. It's a really, really interesting time. But right now we know that, we can see here, this is the percent of visits for influenza-like illness and then the percent of visits for corona-like virus illness. And both viruses really, really do well, with certain, this cooler this time of the year, the humidity, the little bit of a drier humidity through our heating and just through the air. It's a really interesting dynamic there. Other things they can do. There are surveillance opportunities through monitoring the sale of over-the-counter drugs. And they also, in some cases, include things like Pedialyte. So you can look at a population, and this was looking at emergency department visits for fever and influenza, and you can see just ahead of it in New York City, this is 15-year-old data, the over-the-counter sales were a little bit ahead of the actual visits to the emergency room. Now, not everybody who bought an over-the-counter drug went to the emergency room, but as those sales went up, so did the emergency department room visits. This has happened over and over again. This was a couple years before that. You see a spike in the emergency room visits over here, but before that happened, you saw an increase in the actual sales of over-the-counter drugs. Now, there are weird things that happen. I put the picture of the Pedialyte up there because when they started doing some of these, they started seeing all these huge spikes in Pedialyte sales, thinking people were having massive diarrhea events and were dehydrated. And all of this was happening in like mid-March and early April. And they thought, my gosh, there's like a diarrhea-related epidemic. Like all these people have some horrible foodborne or waterborne disease, and it's affecting like a lot of places. And then they started looking and saying, oh, it's all the college campuses. It was during spring break. So they learned their lesson on what happens with Pedialyte sales around spring break from people who were buying in anticipation of becoming dehydrated during their spring break for various reasons. So there are a lot of steps in doing an epidemiological field investigation. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's always important to be able to orient the data, orient our cases in terms of person, place, and time. We need to know who was sick, where they were sick, where have they been, who have they been around, when were they sick, when were they around people. This is one of the most important parts, and that's where contact tracing is really important. For measuring how bad an epidemic happens to be or a pandemic happens to be, there are a few things we tend to want to look for. We want to look at how transmissive, like what's the transmissibility of the virus or the pathogen, what's the kind of the kill rate, like what's the case fatality rate on it. So the attack rate on foodborne and waterborne disease outbreaks, particularly foodborne outbreaks, is one of the most common rates. Now, is the attack rate, a true proportion, or a true ratio? So we call it the attack rate, and it might be something like 40 people ate potato salad at the family reunion, and 14 of those 40 people got sick. So we would do 14 divided by 40, and then that would give us a number. I'll do a different one. We'll do something with easier numbers. 100 people go to a community softball game. After the game, they have food, and then we always blend potato salads, so that's what we're going to blend. So 100 people after the softball game stay under the picnic shelter. It's a hot, sunny day. 100 people, they all eat. They eat coleslaw, they eat fried chicken, they eat baked chicken, they eat broccoli casserole, they eat all kinds of stuff. The potato salad, 50 people out of the 100 eat the potato salad. 25 of those 50 were people that ended up with diarrheal illness. No other food has a percentage that's as high as 50% of the people who ate it got sick. The coleslaw, 15 out of 50 people ate it. So that percentage was 30% got sick. But the potato salad, 50% got sick. So when you do all of the different attack rates, you see that the potato salad had the highest. So that's what would make you think would probably be the culprit for where the outbreak started. Doesn't necessarily mean it was, but it's where you would want to look and focus a lot of attention on. Now, we'll say that 50 people ate potato salad, 25 of the 50 got sick. Is that really a rate? Like, what's the time component there? So you'll hear people call it a rate, but it's really a proportion. 25 of the 50 people got sick. So it's a proportion. Another important, quote, rate is the case fatality rate. Now, you're going to hear a lot in the news about, coronavirus doesn't really kill that many people. Well, yes, coronavirus may not kill a whole lot of people. It still kills a lot of people. Obviously, you've seen the numbers. Even if it kills 1% of all the people who get it, that's like a humongous amount of people. Now, the case fatality rate, or the case fatality proportion is probably what's better said. The case fatality rate is the number of people that die who are deemed cases. So among those who are cases and die, that's the case fatality rate. If they're never a confirmed case, then that's not appropriate to call it case fatality rate. So you need them to be, quote, cases. And we know in the U.S. that the, quote, case fatality rate is a lot higher than what the rate is among those who probably have the virus, who just never got confirmed as a case. So it's important to understand the nuance there in our terminology. All right, so the case fatality rate is really important. Like some diseases like hantavirus have really high case fatality rates. There's another one, Naegleria fowleri, an amoeba that goes up your nose. Some kids have got it doing whitewater rafting in North Carolina. Kids in the deep south sometimes go swimming and get turbidity stirred up. They get their water up their nose when they get dunked by relatives, like bad uncles. They dunk their kids. They get water up their nose. They're all just having a good time, but that sediment that sometimes in natural water has a lot of amoeba in it, it goes up the nose. And sometimes, like a whitewater rafting park, you can Google the one that was in North Carolina. They simulated the Whitewater River. It was in a whitewater river in a park, and a few kids got this amoeba, this Naegleria fowleri, and they died. And some people will get really, really sick, and they have to treat them with like really nasty drugs, and not all of them survive. So some things have really high case fatality rates. So the case fatality rate, just like the attack rate, it's actually better stated probably being a proportion. Like if it's like 5 people get hantavirus camping at Yosemite, and 4 of the 5 die, and I got the picture of the mouse because hantavirus, it's shed in the mice in their stool and their droppings, and it gets dry and powdery, or as the people sweep the droppings up, sometimes it's aerosolized, and it's associated with a pretty high case fatality rate. But it's really better stated being a case fatality proportion, but nobody will ever call it that. So that's an important one. One you're going to hear a lot about, and you've already probably heard a lot about, is the R naught. The R naught value, or the basic reproductive rate, on this particular virus demonstrates that it's still in the disease spread mode. R naught is a function of the kind of the transmissibility from one person to another person, the average rate of contact between a susceptible person and an infected person, and how long the infectiousness lasts. So some things like HIV, AIDS, like it's transmissible when people actually are together, but one, is a sexually transmitted disease. If people are together a long time, that might affect it, but the people who have it are infectious for a really long time. And that makes it have a higher value. So it's not always about how easy does it spread from person to person. It also has to do with how many people will a person infect during the time that they have the disease. And if you have the disease for a really long time, that obviously increases a person's risk of infecting others. If you only have it for 8 days, then that probably minimizes this. But if you only have it for 8 days, but everybody around you gets sick, then that might increase this. So the R naught has a few major components. Now, when you're not potentially infecting typically 2 other people, you're maybe only infecting 1 person at a time. The disease is stable and it's not likely to overwhelm our health systems or overwhelm over-the-counter drug sales or anything like that. When it's 0, you're not spreading it to anybody. So you get the disease like West Nile virus, you're a dead-end host, it doesn't go to anybody. And some diseases, you get it and you only spread it to 1 person because everybody around you has either been vaccinated or it's not easily transmitted. Or everybody around you's already got the disease and had it and had the immunity to defend themselves. Right now, a typical coronavirus patient may infect 2 others if the R naught is 2. We know that these numbers are highly variable. If you're in a plane, the R naught would be a lot higher because people are closer together. If you were in a hospital and you were right when you get admitted, there's a recent article came out in Nature Medicine that said right before you show up at the hospital or at the clinic to get diagnosed with this is when you're spreading the most. So these new people coming into the hospital, these waiting rooms where people are wanting to get tested, those people likely are shedding the most virus. So their R naught is even higher. So the R naught associated with the environment that a person's in can change. And the R naught, I think, for this virus is between like 2 and 5, which isn't too different than, it's between 2 and 4 according to this little paper here. This is a report that McKinsey and Company did with World Health Organization data, and that's a pretty well-respected consulting firm in the business industry and all that. So anyways, COVID-19, SARS, Mideast respiratory syndrome, they're all coronaviruses. They're all kind of in this range. The case fatality rate's likely in the 2% range, and they expect it to go lower. They show here that early identification of cases can potentially affect this. So like we can make the R naught go down, like we can control that. It's not like a fixed thing. Like it's kind of fixed in nature, but we as humans do a lot of things to disrupt nature. So we can create a better environment for humans by getting sick people out of the system. And vaccinations eventually will help, and people getting sick around us will eventually help, and we'll have herd immunity one day. So all those things help. Let's compare those numbers, that 2 to 4, probably about the 2. Pretty similar to the SARS outbreak in the early to mid 2000s. HIV is about 2 to 5. Some things like measles are very infectious. So you don't want to be around somebody who's got measles. That's why we vaccinate for it. Polio, 5 to 7 people would get sick per person. So you can imagine if you get 5 people sick and then they get 5 people sick and then they get 5 people sick, how quickly a polio outbreak could start. So we're lucky to have essentially eradicated it from a lot of countries around the world. Horrible, horrible disease. Oh, and Ebola. Ebola, not as infectious or not as easily spread person to person, apparently, as some of these other ones. So, all right. There's a few different types of outbreaks. So not everything is going to be a respiratory virus or a respiratory illness. And you're going to have to be involved as an environmental health professional and a lot of foodborne outbreaks. And there are a few different types. There's common source, propagated, and mixed ones. The common source ones are the easiest ones. People and things aren't spreading it around. The disease is associated with one agent, and the disease spread is limited to just single agents. So, these 6 people had the potato salad, and 2 of them got sick, and it's only linked to potato salad. Propagated outbreaks are ones where the disease is associated with a single agent, and then the disease spread then may occur after by person-to-person exposures. So this person gets sick from the potato salad, and then eventually the potato salad may go away. Okay? So, and even if it's gone, now this person, only one of them got sick from the potato salad, but they have now infected 2 other people around them through person-to-person spread. So this outbreak was propagated by that event. And then there are other situations where you can have mixed outbreaks, multiple potato salad things contaminated, multiple things contaminated. The disease spread occurs person to person, and then exposures also to potentially multiple agents. I mean, it is the cluster. I mean, these are the hardest ones to deal with. When we deal with infections and poisoning, so you'll hear these terms thrown around by food people and during foodborne disease outbreaks. So foodborne diseases are anything that disrupts our normal bodily functions. That's a disease, right? And it's foodborne or waterborne. What makes it an infection versus a poisoning? So an infection is something where our immune response is there because things are growing and multiplying in us. A poisoning is where something has acted as a toxin, or if it's humans put it in there, or somehow got in there, a toxicant. Those are poisonings. Food infections occur from the result of the ingestion of a pathogen, and then the pathogen starts to reproduce, or we ate a lot of them, and there's an immune response trying to alleviate the illness. That's the infection. It's infectious. Poisonings, and these are often communicable too. An infection in some cases can spread person to person. Not always, but it can spread person to person. A poisoning is when the bacteria, and you often think about like Clostridium botulinum, botulism, it produces botulinum toxin. It's not just the ingestion. You might have an infection going on, but you eat the poisons. You eat the botulinum toxin, or an E. coli 157, if they were in the animal waste that you consumed and they start producing toxins in your body, the toxins that cause the bloody diarrhea, that's poisoning. If the toxins were already present within a matter of hours or even some minutes of eating it, you can already exhibit the signs and symptoms of poisoning. If it takes a couple days, and incubation periods are important in determining what caused the foodborne disease outbreak. Things like norovirus will make somebody sick through the replication of the virus usually within 12 to 48 hours, typically around 24 hours. Viruses make people sick more quicker through an infectious route. Bacteria typically take like 2 to 5 days. They're slower growers than a virus hijacking your immune system or hijacking your cells and replicating. Viruses take longer. Parasites like Cryptosporidium may take 10 to 12 days after a person has been exposed, and maybe even 2 weeks before that cyst that a person's ingested that's lodged in their intestines finally decides it's going to come out and cause the infection. So many viruses are quicker. Bacteria typically are a few days. Parasites may take a couple weeks. Now, a poisoning is rapid. If the toxins are present, the poisoning can occur almost immediately. Now, there are some bacteria like E. coli 0157, Shigella. Those may infect you, and then while your body's responding to the infection, those bacteria also may release toxins, and they may also be involved in poisoning you. There are other types of outbreak investigations, like chronic epidemiology involves like cancer cluster investigations. So there's an unusual cluster. You may go send a field team and interview and investigate people that way. Epidemiological curves are often studied for tracking and understanding outbreaks, so they're called epi curves. This is an example of a propagated outbreak where you can see these 3 definite spikes. This is kind of a single source outbreak. The water main breaks, people get sick, it's starting to decline already, but the boil water advisory is issued, and chlorination has stepped up unless people get sick and the outbreak's over. So that's propagated, that's single source. Cluster outbreaks are much harder to deal with. You would see like a lot more noise up and down, up and down, up and down. All right. Right now, the COVID-19 outbreak, here's an epi curve from Italy. You can see that they really had a stronger peak than a lot of other countries. They did not, quote, flatten the curve. Here in the United States, we have a lot more cases. We also have a lot more people. And our climatic factors and where this arrived in the U.S. really make our situation a lot worse. But anyways, there's a lot to that. But our curve has essentially flattened, which if it didn't flatten as a country, you could imagine it would have went higher and then crashed quicker. When you look at the 1918 epidemic, Nat Geo put this image together. You can see Columbus, Ohio. You can also see on here where you got St. Louis somewhere. There it is, St. Louis. They kind of flattened the curves. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and New Orleans, Boston, they had these huge spikes. And usually if you have these huge spikes, mortality was often associated with more too, because people just couldn't take care of the people. And that would be the case now. Our governor often speaks about this figure, the Philadelphia St. Louis figure. So again, if you flatten the curve, in many cases, you can reduce your cases, and you can also not just reduce your cases, you can also reduce mortality because you won't overwhelm the health system. These are examples of what we call social distancing that was done to help make this possible. Back in the day, there were other terms that were used. Sequestration was a term that's been used. Recently in the, I think it was mid-2000s, the guy who wrote a book called Quarantine, his name is Howard Merkel, he's a physician and medical historian. He called these strategies protective sequestration. I think social distancing sounds better. Some people still think that that's very statist, but protective sequestration sounds even worse. These are examples of what are called NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions. And some people call this a reverse quarantine, or the French call it cordon sanitaire, like, taking the healthy people and keeping them away from the sick rather than keeping the sick away from the healthy. And that's what seemed to work best during the 1918 event, and hopefully it's going to work, or has worked here in the U.S. and the many countries around the world that have used it. So this wraps everything up for our course, and if you've got any questions for me, you can always email me. Again, I encourage you to watch the Ebola video, because the Ebola video is very telling about some of the issues that we are facing right here in the United States as we manage this current pandemic in our nation. So if you have questions, you can always call or contact me at any time. And don't forget to apply for the actual positions that are open with the state government right now as contact tracers while you're still students. And do the census. I'll send you a extra credit option on that. We'll stop there.